welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast as we close out July and welcome you back into Penn State football season. Preseason camp opens on Wednesday. We're recording on Wednesday. There is a lot going on here in Happy Valley, and we're just a few days away from getting back onto the practice fields ourselves for coverage of Penn State preseason camp. On Saturday, we'll have media day, get a chance to hear from a bunch of the coaches, just about every player we want to speak with. And then we'll get back on the field, get a chance to see this team in practice action for the first time since April. And, of course, since then, they have added a bunch of players, transfers and freshmen alike. There are players coming off of injuries that kept them sidelined during spring ball. So we are going to see the real rendition of this 2025 Penn State squad that some people have circled as college football's best team. We're going to break down with a couple of episodes this week, one dropping on a Wednesday, the other coming your way on Friday. Offensive depth chart storylines and defensive depth chart storylines. We were going to try to tackle both in one show. Mark Brennan suggested we split it up. I think it was a good call because we have a lot to get to on both sides of the ball. So without further ado, we're going to bring in Daniel Gallen, Mark Brennan. You heard from Daniel out in Las Vegas. He was joined by Mark at Big Ten Media Days last week. We are all now back in central Pennsylvania, gearing up for our return to the practice field. Guys, good to get you back on board and rock and roll. It is preseason camp. We are go for launch, and we are 31 days away from actually kicking off this season.
And we just got all the game themes, so I'm ready. Stripe out, helmet stripe game.
That's right. Daniel, you got all the details over at Lions247.com. We fill in the blanks for those game themes beyond the whiteout. And so now we have a lot to imagine, and we're going to do that a little bit here today because we haven't seen 11-on-11 football here in Happy Valley since we were inside Beaver Stadium April 26th for the blue-white game. And Daniel, as we start to roll the ball forward, you did a great job giving us the lay of the land from Las Vegas, the highs and lows of your coverage experience there with Penn State. What is maybe the primary unanswered question that you didn't pick up out there in Nevada that you're really curious to take a longer look at come Saturday when we speak with players and coaches, put our binoculars out, and get a look at this team?
I think the big unanswered question that a lot of other people, it's a question that they have too, but we're probably not going to get it answered until the games actually start, is where are the playmakers going to come on offense? That was something that James Franklin talked about during his media session when he was asked about Drew Aller and where Aller can take steps as a quarterback. And he brought up that Aller's improved every year. They expect him to take another big step this year. But a big part of that is going to be who are the guys that are going to step up around him and make plays. Franklin brought up that Tyler Warren was the go-to guy last year where he can go make something happen, make something out of nothing in a couple instances. And going into this year, you bring those two running backs back and Nick Singleton and Katron Allen. But in terms of those, I guess, real pass catchers on the outside, you think about tight ends, you think about wide receivers, it's either guys who are unproven overall. You got Khalil Dinkins is probably the most proven of that group, him and Liam Clifford, and then a ton of guys who aren't proven in Penn State uniforms, guys like Trevor Pena, Kyron Hudson, and Devontae Ross. Franklin mentioned those guys early and often. I got a lot of really good feedback on Kyron Hudson from his former USC teammates that you can read on Lions 24/7. But I think that overall, especially when you talk about the offensive side of the ball, like we're going to talk today, it's who is that playmaker going to be? Who is that guy that on a 3rd and 12 that Drew Aller is going to be looking towards downfield, and who is going to be the guy that will complete that play and make something happen? So where we are July 30th, I don't think guys are going to have that answer when we talk to them on Saturday. Maybe we'll get some insight into who has been eye-catching from the spring through the summer now in the fall camp, but I think that's something I'm really keeping an eye on.
We've got a story up on Wednesday at Lions247.com about how this program has embraced national championship expectations. We talked about that a lot in the last episode from what we heard in Las Vegas, but it has been a continuing theme this offseason, bringing in Jim Knowles, major roster retention success, going out and picking up some projected starters out of the transfer portal who are proven playmakers at other power conference schools. And you add that up and you have a level of excitement and buzz around this program. Again, leapfrogging Ohio State and Oregon in some of these Big Ten preseason media polls. ESPN elevated to the #1 team in their top 25 at one point this offseason. So a lot on the table for Penn State this season, Mark. And obviously, if our listeners and our viewers want the true Lions 24/7 VIP experience, well, you got to take the plunge into VIP territory. It just so happens August 1st, which is Friday, is the day that we open up a new window for promotion. And Mark, could you let our listeners and viewers know just about how they could tap into what we've got cooking for the month of August and beyond?
Well, I'm not going to give away all the details because I might get yelled at from the higher ups, but just be prepared for Friday, August 1st, for another good deal to come out. And we'll have some different specials throughout preseason camp. I will get that stuff posted midnight, August 1st, which would be late Thursday going into Friday. People know I'm a little bit of a night owl, so we will have that out there. But just so you know, if you're watching this pod, don't subscribe today. Wait a couple days. I'm going to leave it at that. We want to give all of our great pod listeners just the opportunity to save themselves some money. One other thing I wanted to throw in, Tyler and Daniel, about storylines and how things are kind of working for this offense, and having the opportunity to talk to Nick Dawkins out in Vegas. This is like from the good problem to have. How are they going to slot all of these offensive linemen that they have? I mean, right now they have more than 5 guys who have quality starting experience. And we know that they have 7, 8 guys who are probably legit Big Ten caliber starting offensive linemen. I haven't seen this since the mid-90s. I mean, those, my friend Keith Conlon and Jeff Harding's in that group, like in 92, 93, before they really emerged as that nucleus in 94, they were kind of backups on and working their way up to the first team on these super deep offensive lines. And I don't know that I've seen that. So when we could talk about who are the playmakers that are going to emerge. Absolutely. I mean, that's question number one, but I'm anxious to see what Phil Trautwein and the rest of the staff, how they're going to work these guys in, and how much of it are we not going to be necessarily looking at your prototypical starting offensive line. Maybe this could be more like Penn State's defensive line, where, somebody is named the starting defensive tackle or somebody is named the starting defensive end, but they are going to be platooning guys throughout the game. Ideally, James Franklin's always been a 5 offensive lineman guy and maybe rotate in a 6th or a 7th, but I think they're going to have good problem to have. This is where you want to be, and this is what Phil Trautwein and his staff has built.
Yeah,
Nick Dawkins had a funny comment out in Las Vegas where he said, defensive line gets to rotate the whole game. Why can't the offensive line? And I think that it's a little bit different when you talk about communication and needing all those guys to work as one. But I think that it's an interesting problem to have, as Mark laid out. And on the cover of the Town and Gown magazine in State College, you had the 8 Penn State offensive linemen. So I think that's your starting point, I think, for the guys that we could see a lot of this year.
It is a fascinating storyline. It is so far removed from the offensive line narrative that existed when Phil Trautwein came here to campus, even the first few seasons under Phil Trautwein, to where they are now. We will break down that offensive line group in a moment because there are several potential platoon options there for Phil Trautwein to work with. But let's begin this conversation. Let's begin this conversation at one specific spot on the offensive line. That's at right tackle, because as we work through the possibilities, it feels like that's the biggest domino that's going to have to get figured out. And then when that falls, maybe that leads to some answers at guard and other places on the offensive line. But last year we saw Anthony Donko win the job in August, entered the season as the guy, but that didn't prevent Nolan Rucci from getting action. I believe he was involved for 20-plus snaps in about 5 games before he stepped up late in November and with Anthony Donko sideline and was your starting right tackle throughout the postseason. Both of those guys showed up, looked like they belonged as starting right tackles for Penn State. They're still there, and so you start to factor in that Javen Williams was the right tackle for this offense through spring ball, through the blue-white game. Well, there is some catching up to do, maybe some rust to shake off as Phil Trautwein assesses that position. So, Daniel, Mark, when you review this, and we'll go to Hugh here, Mark, when you review Anthony Donko versus Nolan Rucci and then Javen Williams, obviously they're going to give him a chance there, but I feel like we're pretty focused on those 2 guys who were there in that spot last year. What do you think are the key points that Phil Trautwein needs to take into consideration beyond just who's going to be the first guy that lines up at right tackle? You're also talking about potentially impacting your right guard spot, as Landon Tengwall referenced last week, Anthony Donko has guard experience. He played guard all the way through high school, didn't make that move until late in his freshman year ahead of the Peach Bowl. And so it feels like if Nolan Rucci was to outright win that job, maybe you give him a look at guard too, but that gets us into a whole different conversation on the interior.
Yeah, I mean, I never thought I'd say this, but Anthony Donko at 6'5", 326, he's actually a better physical fit at guard, I would think, than Nolan Rucci, who's 6'8", and he's every bit of 6'8". I mean, at the college level, you just don't see that many 6'8" guards, do you? And I think the other thing that could come into play here, and this is something that we should ask Trout about, is which one of those guys is more capable at playing both sides. So if you want to have that flexibility to have somebody who's going to give Drew Shelton a break over on the left side, how does that kind of factor into it? But as I look at it, just looking at these guys physically and remembering how well Rucci played at the end of the season when he went in there, he would seem like the more logical right tackle to me at this point, knowing that I think as you said, Landon said, Donko seems just to be a more physically kind of inclined to play, not inclined, but just seems to more have that guard type of build. But again, we're going back to good problems to have, right? I mean, when you're trying to figure out who's going to fit where, my guess would be that Rucci would be the guy who kind of emerges, and that you have Donko could play either guard, and then how are you going to use that flexibility? Who's going to be able to go over and back up Shelton? Knock on wood, hopefully nothing happens to him, but we've seen guys get banged up, and you want to have guys ready to go.
And Daniel, the domino effect that I alluded to there is if you were to move Donko inside, and let's say that by the end of preseason camp, Phil Trautwein determines that Nolan Rucci is their best solution at right tackle, he stays there. Well, who's coming off the field? Because I don't think it's Venga Ioane. He's a preseason All-American. A lot of people are picking him as a redshirt junior. And then you've got Cooper Cousins, the sophomore, who's been the heir apparent to become the face of this offensive line. Since he got to campus, it feels like everyone you speak to points to him as being a future face of this program. And we've had him really firmly penciled in as a starter at the other guard position, despite them bringing in TJ Shanahan from Texas A&M and having some other pieces there. But does that complicate maybe the scenario we've envisioned for a while now, where if Anthony Donko bumps inside, we're not even getting to Javen Williams yet, mind you, but if Anthony Donko bumps inside, all of a sudden there's 3 guards, there's 2 spots, and you've got another rotational conversation.
Yeah, I think that it's an interesting situation to be in if you do get there. I think the one thing to remember with Donko is that he won that right tackle job last year. And I know that Nolan Rucci saw some playing time in the throughout the season before Donko got injured, but it wasn't a timeshare. I mean, it was pretty clearly Anthony Donko's job. So I think in my head, even though Rucci finished the season starting as that right tackle, and I think he got better as those last couple of games went along, as the postseason went along. In my view, Donko is still that incumbent right tackle. Now, I do think that, he gives you a little bit more flexibility in terms of being able to move inside than Rucci does, just given his build and his previous experience playing guard. So I think that's something that you have to factor in. But yeah, I think you could be looking at an interesting ripple effect here when you talk about rotating guys, moving them around, trying to find playing time for all these guys. I think maybe in that type of situation, James Franklin alluded to it a little bit last week in Las Vegas, where you might see guys get pulled a little bit early when Penn State gets up 3 touchdowns, whereas maybe in the past you'd keep guys out for an extra drive in the 3rd, 4th quarter with that lead. You have a little bit of a quicker hook with your veterans to get this depth in here. That's something that I see to get a lot of these guys into the game. And maybe you do see some sort of rotation, with Ioane to get other guys into the field a little bit more. We saw it last year that when they wanted to get JV Nelson snaps at left guard, Venga didn't leave the field. They just bumped him over to right guard and took Sal Wormley off the field. So I think that you do have options here. I'm definitely of the view that you want to keep things as, I think, consistent as possible. I'm a big proponent of when you remove a guy from that, when you make a change or there's an injury or you have to do a substitution, that you keep it one for one. Like you take out the left guard and you put someone in at left guard, as opposed to moving that left guard to center and then taking the center out. Because in that situation, you really have two new players on your line as opposed to just one. But we've seen that Phil Trautwein's willing to do both in terms of rotating and moving guys to different spots. I'm really interested to hear from guys how this is playing out. Interested to see little glimpses that we can get in practice to see where guys are lining up. But I think that right side of that offensive line is going to be really, really interesting to follow.
Yeah, and you bring up a few points there about Rucci. I think he would have maybe 70 total game snaps under his belt until last season and through 3 seasons at Wisconsin, despite being a former 5-star. I just wonder how the staff's interpretation of who he is as a player and his own internal interpretation of who he is as a player changed between the end of November and mid-January, and what that maybe means for their game plan and what it might mean for Nolan Rucci's mindset going into his final college campaign. And let's remember, Anthony Donko, just a redshirt sophomore, same class as Javen Williams. And that's where I want to take the conversation now. Last year, it felt like there was 8 offensive linemen who were in that mix. You had J.B. Nelson and Cooper Cousins working in the interior. And then for much of the season until Donko goes down, you've got Rucci as your swing tackle. Mark, I think that probably answers your question. Who would be more comfortable playing left and right tackle? Nolan Rucci got a world of experience doing that throughout last year in games, in the practice field. I'm not necessarily aware of Anthony Donko taking those kind of reps on both tackle positions. But I think ultimately, as you try to work out who's going to be 6, 7, 8, 9 maybe for this offensive line, and I'll remind folks that, we were told by Phil Trautwein directly this summer that he thinks he can play up to 11 guys in the season opener and around 8 or 9 against an Oregon on their schedule in the heart of Big Ten season. And so I think you've got to start with the guys we've been discussing, and whether it's Rucci or Donko, call him your 6th person. Then you factor in TJ Shanahan, who just came in from Texas A&M in January. He started 5 games last year for the Aggies. He's a redshirt sophomore. And then Javen Williams. He was your first-team right tackle during spring ball. He could also play guard. He has played guard. He was predominantly a guard at the high school level. And that's 8 names right there. That's without me getting to Alex Birchmeier, who James Franklin said the light has come on, the switch has flicked, whatever phrase he applied. Has been a very strong offseason for Alex Birchmeier, a former top 100 prospect. There are other players in the mix, but 8 or 9 guys that are right there. Out of those I mentioned, Daniel, who are maybe on the sideline, on the fringe of that starting lineup, guys who maybe we're looking at in 2026 as starters, who do you think is the most compelling prospect at this point of their career?
Yeah, that's a really good question, especially given the amount of talent that Trautwein has stockpiled. I think Birchmeier is really interesting. I mean, all those 3rd-year guys that you have in there are in really interesting positions in their career. Talked a lot about Donka. I think Javen Williams has the potential to be the swing guy this year in terms of inside, outside, plugging holes wherever you need him to. It seems like he's really gotten a lot of cross-training over the course of his career. But I think Birchmeier, just because everyone's development curve is different. You talk about a guy that at one point was in that 5-star recruit range. Really hard for an interior offensive lineman to finish a cycle there. But he's someone who is very highly regarded. So I think that, to me, Birchmeier is the one where, can he force the issue in there? And you already have so many, we're already talking about 3 or 4 guys on that interior. And especially when you consider that, really hard to see Vanga Ioane leaving the field in meaningful reps. Really hard to see Nick Dawkins leaving the field when during a meaningful time in the game. And then I think it's also hard to see Cooper Cousins leaving the field during a meaningful time of the game, given the type of player we expect him to be. So I think Birchmeier is the one where, if he can elevate himself to be that 9th guy, I think it presents quite the balancing act when you factor in TJ Shanahan, when you factor in that Donga could play guard, when you think about Javen Williams also getting some guards. So there's so many guys that you can blank on them. So I think I'd go with Birchmeier right here.
I'll be curious to see, who's first involved in a game. Is it TJ Shanahan, guy who's played SEC football? He has that game experience, had some work to do in terms of his physicality and his physical frame since moving to campus last winter. Or is it Alex Birchmeier, who we haven't really seen a game action? This is his third year within this program. That'll be something interesting to follow because there should be opportunities against Nevada, against Florida International, against Villanova for us to see a lot of these offensive linemen. And I'll add one more at guard, a guy that we're not really talking about pushing for a starting job or really in the too deep, but another former top 24/7 prospect in Chimdi Ono, who's been working on the interior. And Mark, I think circling back to your point earlier about how it feels like we're not just focused on the front five here. You're starting to peel back the layers of the offensive line room and being like, that might be a future first-round pick there who's now a second or third string player. And I think there's a really intriguing situation at left tackle. Maybe it's Javen Williams or Nolan Rucci steps over there if Drew Shelton can't go. But you've got Egan Boyer, who showed up on campus at 238 pounds in January 2024. He's added about 55 pounds. We're hearing tremendous things about what he can become as an offensive tackle. He's a redshirt freshman. And then Malachi Goodman gets to campus in June, early June. He's already over 320 pounds. Grace Brennan captured a great photo of him when he was
40-inch vertical.
Yeah, jumping all over the place. We know the athleticism speaks for itself. He's a 5-star recruit. And so this is kind of fun. The conversation about Phil Trautwein's room isn't necessarily who's going to be blocking, the Buckeyes defensive line November 1st in Columbus. It's about what's brewing beyond those starters, even beyond the two deep, and how it could take shape in 2026 and beyond. And so, Mark, sprinkling that in, how much intrigue do you have in this room in general?
Oh, a ton. I mean, you mentioned Egan Boyer. I could envision him being the guy who, when we're at practice, is taking second team reps at left tackle, even though we know that if Shelton got hurt, they would probably move one of the more veteran players over there. But we've seen that. I mean, it's the same thing with center where we see Ruley taking the second team reps, but we pretty much know that if Nick Dawkins got bumped up, and no disrespect to Ruley, who's a great member of this team and obviously made a great call at Minnesota last year on special teams, very well regarded. But I think if Dawkins got bumped up, they would move probably Wenger or Cooper Cousins over to center. But yeah, Egan Boyer, I mean, I just look at that kid, and we've heard nothing but great things. Every bit of 6'8". Again, I mean, came in here at 240. Was it? Did you say, Tyler?
And 238, and the lightest offensive lineman ever to come into Phil Trautwein's room was 235. Lindstrom up at Boston College. He ended up being an all-pro and the NFL's highest-paid guard when it was all said and done. So,
right, but Boyer actually saw the field last year. I mean, he's still redshirted, but he actually got out there, and not necessarily key reps. But hey, if you're a true freshman playing, that's as an offensive lineman, that's a really good thing. When you talk about the most intriguing guys, I just want to circle back. They're going to have to figure out something to do with Cooper Cousins. I mean, and that's why I'm saying that's why this offensive line thing. I mentioned it toward the top. This is going to be the most fun area to watch because this is going to be intense competition. And the one thing that I would say about this, and you guys know this because we were at camp, and what do we see at almost every one of those prospect camps? These offensive linemen all hanging out, palling around, and it's one of those instances where this is fierce competition, but these guys really get along. Yeah. Like we saw Wenger at I think most of the camps. We saw Cooper Cousins at every single camp. I think Cooper Cousins was probably going and working like state high camp, and then going down and working Pee Wee football camp.
Coach Cousins.
Yeah, I'm making that part up, but. It kind of filtered down to where when Malachi got there, he was out there at the camps with them. So I think not only do you have all this talent, but they've developed this rapport within that room that to be able to have that with the level of competition they have, I just think is absolutely tremendous. It was fun at the Penn State prospect camps. I don't know about you guys, but you're seeing Wenger, who's going to be a first-round draft pick, in my view, out there hanging out with freshman offensive linemen. You know what I mean? And not that I expected anything different, but Jesus, we're all buddies. We're hanging out. Wenger, Malachi, Cooper Cousins, all those guys were there. So that part of it was really fun to watch.
That group, culturally, physically, from a production standpoint, maybe they could be at the forefront of this season for Penn State, which is, you remember that 2021 season, Daniel, I believe it was your first covering the team. how ugly it was for the offensive line. They seemed terrified to play anybody but Bryce Effner off the bench. I think they played like 6 guys. They couldn't run the football. And now we're talking about a team that can run the football, and how can they play 9 or 10 guys because you got that kind of talent. So it has really changed. Daniel, the one spot I wanted to recenter the focus on, pun intended, Nick Dawkins is a 6-year senior. He's gone after this year. He's been a staple for you as a leader. And at that center position, he was well over 90% snap share last year at that spot. Beyond him, we've got some things to figure out, I think. You mentioned, Mark, that Dominic Rulli, a walk-on, has been the second teamer. But if Dawkins were to go down and you needed a center in the thick of the action, where would that maybe come from? Would it be Rulli or would it be elsewhere? And you've got Cooper Cousins gain experience snapping the football in practice. Venga Ioane has that experience. TJ Shanahan has that experience. He was a versatile prospect coming out of high school, a versatile pickup out of the transfer portal from Texas A&M. And then Michael Troutman, the true freshman that I've heard a lot of good things about and what his future might look like at center. He's a center all the way. Some of these other guys were kind of bouncing between two positions. But Daniel, how much of the storyline is that for this offensive line, figuring out who's next up at center? Because we've got these groups of players at guard and tackle that we feel pretty strongly have a bright future. There's names there at center, but some might be starting at guard next year. And so it's a little bit more of a balancing act, I would imagine, for Phil Trautwein behind Nick Dawkins.
I think this will be one of those things that we get an answer to maybe in the third quarter against Nevada or FIU, when you start to see these line changes and you start to see guys sub in and sub out. I remember last year we saw Venga Ioane slide over to center at different points during the game. I know later on, when Penn State was starting to get its second teamers in a little bit. So I do think that if you did need to make a change either in the heat of the action or even for a longer period of time, I do think that you would see someone who is already part of that guard rotation. I think you'd see someone from there slide over to center, like a Cousins, like a Venga, like a TJ Shanahan, perhaps. I think that's where you'd put that focus. I think to me, Michael Troutman probably profiles as maybe a center of the future, that sort of thing, where you've got him in that spot, you're grooming him there. He's getting a lot of experience. I think that's going to be interesting to follow. But I think that if you are Penn State and you need to make a change, I think that you're going to go with one of these guys who's already been playing, decent reps or significant reps to keep him on the field and to keep your best 5 on the field, your best 6 on the field. I think that's where you would look for that number 2 center.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the answer is probably pulling a guy in from guard, bringing your next man on the interior from the bench, and then working it from there. Again, we don't expect Nick Dawkins to spend much time watching football this year outside of maybe these second halves in some of these matchups. But a key player, the Warfel Award winner last year, and just a heartbeat of this locker room as well. All right, guys, we got the offensive line covered. A lot of familiar faces.
One other quote, Tyler.
What do you got for us?
I was there. Nick Dawkins had this to say, which I thought was great. Imagine what we could do with multiple O-line sets that we can do on short yardage, goal line, low red zone, third down, fourth down, and such like that. It just adds so many elements. We can legitimately do so many things. And then he talked about using offensive linemen as fullbacks and doing all sorts. I mean, we saw a little bit of that last year. So it's going to be interesting, not just what Trautwein is able to do, but what Kotelnicki comes up with all of this stuff. So Nick Dawkins had a kind of a gleam in his eye when he was talking about that stuff, as if we may see some fun stuff from this O-line. So I just wanted to get that in before we wrapped up the O-line.
I love that, because you're talking about preparing for an opponent. You're always, factoring in how their defensive front can change with different body types and different athleticism. If you start to factor that in an offensive line in different situations, although to Daniel's point and to the point Landon Tengwall made last week, it's a little tricky when you're going in and out and in and out and not getting those consistent reps. And so that's the juggling act that Phil Trautwein has to do up front. So as I said, going from a room that we know a lot about, feel pretty strongly about, to a room where it very well may be a full slate of new starters who were in different college uniforms last year and even this spring. Wide receiver, Marcus Hagans, year 3. This is the hot topic of conversation for Penn State for another offseason. Harrison Wallace, Omari Evans were your starters there last year. Each had their moments. Both are gone. Evans at Washington and Harrison Wallace down at Ole Miss. Obviously, we've covered a bunch. They have responded by bringing in transfers of their own. They have Kyron Hudson and Devontae Ross throughout spring ball. They add Trevor Pena on the final day of spring ball. He shows up from Syracuse. And all of a sudden, you've got this trio of accomplished players who've done it at this level. They're older players. And Daniel, it feels like for so long we've been saying who's going to step up, who's going to prove they belong. Well, now it feels like as long as you can get these guys to mesh, and it sounds like the meshing has happened, they're going to be at the forefront of this conversation. It's not going to be these, 3 of these guys are going to be among your top 6 wide receivers. It feels like it's trending towards these being your top 3 receivers. And I don't want to shut out Liam Clifford quite yet or some of these other competitors, but man, it feels like Penn State not just reset its room here, Daniel, but they are loading up the eggs in those baskets. We'll see what it looks like, but it is all systems go right now for these 3 transfer players. They're going to get the opportunity that they hoped for, and now Penn State has to hope that they saw the right kind of potential, the right kind of developmental progress when they were scouring the receiver market for options.
Definitely. I think you brought it up when I was in Las Vegas, Tyler, that in James Franklin's opening, in his press conference, when he was up in the podium, he's asked about, I think, playmakers, or he brings up the wide receivers, and he mentioned the 3 transfers, and that was about it. I think that a lot of the Penn State passing game in terms of the wide receivers, I think it starts with those transfers. What can you get out of them? What can they bring? How quickly can they really assimilate? I know that Ross and Hudson were here in the spring, so they have a leg up. Pena got here over the summer, so he's going to be a little bit behind the 8 ball. But we've heard good things about the way that Drew Aller runs these player-led, passing drills, meetings, everything along those lines. So I think it'll be interesting to hear from Pena or hear from others about where he is at this point in the calendar, with the season starting, as of Saturday in less than a month. But yeah, I think that when you look at the returning guys on the roster, it's going to be difficult for them to, I think, find a real path for playing time. I do think that it's clear that Liam Clifford has the respect of Marcus Hagans and James Franklin and the staff with what he has done during his time at Penn State and the way that he goes about his business. But that doesn't necessarily to translate to being on the field, on 3rd and 11 in the 4th quarter of a 3-point game against Oregon in late September. I think Tysier Denmark is someone that I'm really interested to see where he is in year 2. I think that he's someone who has the right kind of mindset to compete and to fight for playing time on the field. How does it actually come together? And then the 4 freshmen who joined the room, is someone from that group going to make a splash? I think that we've liked what we've heard about Kobe Howard. We liked what we saw from him in the blue-white game. I'm really curious if he can avoid maybe hitting that freshman wall in fall camp, and that's something completely different to him in terms of the physical nature of this, physical playing in the Big Ten. How is he handling that? How is he continuing to grow? I think whenever we do those roster updates, his weight keeps ticking up. He's a really well-built guy. I think you can see him really being able to be a physical player for this offense. So I think you have quite a few options. You've got a lot of interesting guys. Maybe someone that we're not talking about finally breaks through. But I feel like it might have been 21 or 22 where James Franklin said, we feel like we have a 2 deep across the board at wide receiver. And that's really never come to pass over these past couple of years. Is that going to be, will that happen this year? I still don't know. I think the pieces are there. It's just going to be a question of where are these guys in their development? How can they take their steps forward?
I think what was such a maddening dynamic for people as they watched the receiver group really struggle to find its footing and elevate this offense in recent seasons was the lack of alternative options. Last year, it would throw the same 4 guys out there. It was Harrison Wallace, Omari Evans, Liam Clifford, Julian Fleming. There wasn't room in that conversation based on what Marcus Hagans was picking up on the practice field for anyone else. I know Tysier Denmark got a touchdown in the last play of the regular season, but he retained his redshirt status. He was not a factor in the postseason after that matchup. And so, Mark, I think that the conversation here does go beyond who are your 3 starters, whether that's the transfers, whether the Liam Clifford can elbow one of those guys out and maintain his status in the lineup. That's great, but doesn't this need to be a group that Marcus Hagans can confidently and Andy Kotelnicki can confidently call upon 5, 6, maybe 7 wide receivers? Because I think that's been a big issue. It hasn't just been lack of maybe a star power at the top, but it's been a lack of depth that this staff trusts to go out and run routes for its quarterback.
Yeah, and, the guy I'm interested in too is Caden Saunders. I mean, we haven't seen him healthy in his career yet, have we? Or, I mean, it just, especially last year, he was out the whole year. And, we talked to him in the winter and he talked about how he's full go. So if he is full go, he's somebody who I think could really emerge as part of that conversation. But yeah, I mean, they need depth. It's like the opposite of what we're seeing at wide receiver. And it's kind of hard to understand how it kind of got here when you have this 5-star quarterback who you would imagine every receiver would want to play with. So I think there's a lot of eyes on this program and a lot of eyes on that position to finally get it done this year. One other thing Franklin said, Daniel, and you probably remember this, was I'm paraphrasing. I was trying to go through the 45-minute transcript and I couldn't quite get there, but how they're kind of done taking gambles on people in a transfer portal, that they want to bring in people who are kind of proven commodities. So that's where I think maybe he was getting at when he was up on the main podium talking about the guys that they brought in. I think he's viewing them as guys who have proven themselves other places, and rightfully so, because they did. Now, are they able to maintain that here is another question. But as you said, Tyler, it goes beyond that. So they are going to need some of these guys to step up. And I think it's time, listen, is it fair to wonder why Tyseer Denmark wasn't playing more last year when nobody else was doing anything? I mean, when he got in there, he was productive. Yes, he dropped the pass. I think it was at Wisconsin, but he was open. I mean, and that's where I just don't kind of get what they've been doing. I think it's time to forget about seniority, forget about all that stuff. And, listen, if you have a true freshman, a Lyric Samuel, who's too skinny, but we saw him makes plays in the blue-white game, get your playmakers out there. I think they're to that point now where enough with this, relying on guys because they're dependable or whatever. You need playmakers. And when you think how close they were to getting to the national title game without consistent receivers, how close they were with no receiver catching a pass in the Orange Bowl, and they're still this close to getting to the national title game. That just tells you how much better they'll be if they get consistent production from that group. And nobody's looking for over-the-moon production because their running backs are good enough, and we'll get there, I know, but the tight ends, I think we all agree, even with Tyler Warren moving on, are good enough. So they don't need this to be the dominant area. They just need consistent production, which we haven't seen since Parker Washington, maybe. I mean, who was the last consistent receiver they had? They just haven't had it.
Yeah, you got to go back to 2002, Parker Washington, and you had Mitch Tinsley throughout that season, pretty consistent too. But yeah, it's been a while. And look, Daniel, I think it's pretty fascinating here because you've got the names that we've been scrambling through for a while and wondering if they're going to show up. And Tyseer Denmark and Kobe Howard are among them, but the slot position is really where we saw them involved during that blue-white game. And the slot position is where we saw a lot of Liam Clifford. The slot position is also where Trevor Pena took like 75 to 80% of his snaps at Syracuse. So to me, we're going to get to tight ends really, really soon here, but you're competing from trying to keep two tight ends off the field and keeping 3 wide receivers out there. And in that slot particular, I think it could be a bit of a logjam to figure out how guys fit. Because if Trevor Pena is going to be a plug-and-play guy that we're going to see get a long leash, that could maybe negatively impact our ability to see Tyseer Denmark, Kobe Howard out there getting some of their run. Because, again, that's where they were pretty focused in on when we saw them throughout much of preseason camp or throughout much of spring camp. So I think just another thing to note there and kind of as we're working through this, and Peter Gonzalez would be another name I would toss to the conversation. Missed last season with an injury. He's a redshirt freshman. Hopefully he can get his feet underneath him a bit. But, Daniel, there's just a long list of names. Few of them have proven much. And I think when you factor in Devontae Ross, top 20 last year in college football in yards per game, you have Kyron Hudson coming in. He was more productive last year with USC as a team captain than anybody in a Nittany Lions uniform has been during their career at any point. And then you've also got, of course, Coming in from Syracuse, Trevor Pena, almost 1,000 receiving yards last year, 80 catches, 10 touchdowns. And so it's hard to look away from that group. Who would be your dart throw, though, Daniel? If we're asking you here at the end of July. Maybe we'll ask you again at the end of August. Who do you think outside of that transfer group, maybe outside of Clifford too, because we've seen him get some run, who do you think could do the most with more looks in game action?
I think Peter Gonzalez is interesting, given that he's a little bit of a different body type than some of these other guys that we've talked about. I mean, Tyler, you just ran through all the guys that could potentially play in the slot. And that is a body type that you see a lot on this Penn State roster. The one thing I will say about if you have a log jam at the slot and you have all these guys that can, that could potentially contribute, but you don't know how to get them onto the field, I think that's where Andy Kotelnicki steps in. That's where coaching takes over in terms of putting these guys in situations where they can succeed if they have something that they can do really well. We saw Liam Clifford taking a lot of jet motion snaps in the blue-white game. I think that's where coaching, and game planning really takes over. But in terms of a dart throw, I mean, I think that Peter Gonzalez, he is healthy, is back, is someone that has a unique body type in this room. I think Kyron Hudson is similar to him in terms of what you've added to add some bulk, add some size. I think with Eric Samuel, you add height. With Jeff Exner, you add bulk. But those two guys are they're unproven at this level. We'll see what we get from them. But Gonzalez, even though he was hurt last year, he's been in the program, been around things. I think that he is someone to, monitor. That maybe if you look at the top 6 guys at the position as Pena, Ross, Hudson, Clifford, Denmark, and Howard, can Peter Gonzalez be that 7th, or can he unseat someone in that top 6 with how you're looking at things right now? I think that he's a guy I'll be monitoring, keeping an eye out for.
Well, meanwhile, at tight end, you lose an All-American, one of the best to do it in a Penn State uniform, and Tyler Warren, and yet people aren't sprinting towards the panic button here about what comes next at that position. James Franklin says it whenever he has the opportunity. He feels like they have recruited and developed at this position better than anybody across college football. I think you look at the NFL draft results, they speak very highly of that, and the same at the on-field production. And now you look who's going to step up next. And, you think about when programs have been cooking at a specific position. Remember that run where Alabama seemed to have a Heisman Trophy candidate every year at running back? Well, there was always the next guy up behind them who was biding his time. It feels like that's what we're seeing from the Penn State tight end room. We know Tyler Warren waited his turn, took advantage of it. Now Khalil Dinkins enters that kind of a spotlight. He's got a couple guys who have been attached to him with that tight end conversation throughout the offseason. Sophomore Luke Reynolds, and then redshirt sophomore Andrew Rappleyea, who missed all but one game last year because of an injury on the practice field. So those are the 3 names that were out of James Franklin's mouth in Las Vegas when talking about replacing Tyler Warren. Maybe somebody else steps up outside of that trio. We'll talk about some potential guys in a moment. But, Mark, when you try to come up with the pecking order here and who gives Penn State the best chance to have a lethal offense, where do you wrap your head around these 3? Dinkins, Rappleyea, Reynolds.
Yeah, well, I mean, what we hear about Dinkins is he's an elite blocker for a tight end. So I think when you look at the makeup of this team, even if you look at the makeup of last year's team, I mean, that's why he played so much, because he was very good. Now, are they going to try to make him also more of a receiving weapon? I mean, he's like the old Chris Carter. All he does is catch touchdowns. I don't know. I don't know that they necessarily need to force that into him when you have guys like Reynolds and Rappleyea. For people who haven't seen Rapp, I mean, we saw him in practice before he was injured, and we saw him in practice as a true freshman. And this guy looks like he's the real deal as well. So I think between that 3, you have enough of a nucleus that you're going to be able to do anything. But to me, the question is, does Dinkins also emerge as more of a receiving threat, of a consistent receiving threat? I think he has the talent to do so, but I'm not sure that they necessarily need that. I think you look at the job he's done as a blocker, and to me, that is what they need out of that guy more than necessarily the receiving end, because we know that Reynolds and Rapp both have the ability. We know Reynolds for sure. We've seen it in games. I mean, his ability to go up and make plays in space or get, elevate and make plays is kind of elite. So I think the tools are all there. It's just a matter of how they use Dinkins.
Yeah, I think maybe with Dinkins, you're looking at like Brenton Strange type with longer run and not a guy who's going to pick up 15-yard gains, but a guy who can move the chains and most importantly, help you in the run game. He is a highly respected blocker at the tight end position. With Luke Reynolds, I'm reminded more of maybe a young Mike Gesicki, a guy who can go up and get it. I mean, we've been reminded of that comparison for a while. But
I think he's more willing to block than Gesicki was. Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say certainly from where Mike was as a sophomore, I think he's further along physically. But in terms of a guy who can maybe go and be a vertical threat and get a couple of those targets, to me, the wild card is Andrew Rappleyea, because I've always compared him to Pat Freiermuth, who I think is an incredibly balanced tight end, a guy who could block his ass off and was really, really smooth as a receiver here at Penn State. Andrew Rappleyea, the stage was set for him last year to maybe push off Khalil Dinkins and end up asserting himself as the number 2 guy. And then our conversation right now in 2025 is entirely different. Didn't happen that way. He spent most of the season on crutches, and so we still had to figure things out with him. We'll start to do that in August. He wasn't around for spring ball. He wasn't competing, so big chance for us to see number 87. Beyond those 3, Daniel, I know you're a big fan of this tight end room. They just added another premier prospect in Andrew Olish. He's one of 3 freshman tight ends. Joey Schlaffer's come a long way physically in his 3rd year on campus. When you talk about that mix of guys outside of the trio, there were injuries last year. Something pops up again like that and someone has to step up. Who are you most intrigued by from the non-primary tight end group that we've been discussing?
I mean, I think that you just start from the recruiting perspective and what we saw in camp action. And I think the lengths that Penn State went to get him on the campus. I think you start with Andrew Olish there with his pedigree, in-state kid, really good receiver. We really liked what we saw from him at that Elite 11 All-22 regional camp in State College last spring. We'll see where he is in his physical development when you get through August. Right now he's listed at 6'5", 226. Brian Kordovich, we saw him out on the camp fields. His high school from the Cleveland area was in-state college for a 7-on-7 event over the summer. And so he was hanging out with those guys, walking around with them. He's listed at 6'4", 243. Wouldn't be a surprise if he's up above 250 pretty soon. I mean, he's just enormous. And I think that he's someone that we also saw camping last summer. And I think that he caught our eye a little bit. There's some other guys on the board, things like that. And he's that late flip from Purdue in the recruiting process. So I think that he's someone that we don't necessarily have the same familiarity with as maybe a Matt Henderson, who got in the boat and was in it. And, we were able to monitor his growth a little bit, or an Olish, who was just such a high profile prospect that we had an eye on every one of his movements. So I think Kordovich is someone that's really interesting to learn some things about, but he just looked so ready physically in what we saw. And Henderson too, he got that number 44. We picked that up when Mark saw them at the Children's Hospital. That raises your eyebrows a little bit. And he was someone that I think his junior year of high school was, 195 pounds, got up over 200 for his senior year. He's listed at 230 now. So that's someone that the strength program is working with him. Does that mean any of these 3 could break through in a certain way? It's really hard. It's a hard path, I think. But we've seen Ty Howell in the past couple of years really be able to juggle these different things. Penn State isn't afraid to put 3 tight ends out there. If they need a tight end to line up in the backfield next to Aller and a running back, they can do that. I think you have a lot of different ways to be flexible here if someone is ready. And then I think Joey Schlaffer, just interesting to see where he is at this point. Someone that has really transformed his body. Another one of these guys who came in with his weight in the 210s. He's up over 250 pounds now, 3rd year in the program. What could he do? I think he was someone that this spring, in addition, it was him and maybe Kordovich were the 2 that when you looked across the field at the tight ends and you saw who stood out physically in terms of their frames, I think Kordovich and Schlaffer were the 2 where my eyes went there. The first, does that translate on Saturdays? I'm not really sure. But this is where I think that when Penn State if things go towards their plan and they get up big in these non-conference games, I think we're all going to be zeroed in on tight end. I think tight end and offensive line are really going to be the two positions that we're zeroed in on. Who's coming in? What are they doing? What do they look like?
Somewhat similar to the offensive line. It feels like we're focused in on a top group that we think is going to be, there present for us week to week to week, trying to win a national championship. And then there's a group behind them that seems like they could be a supplemental part. Maybe if an injury happens, they pop up, but you're developing them. You're trying to strengthen your future at this position at tight end. And when we look at running back, we can skip the conversation for the top of the lineup. It's going to be Nick Singleton and Kaytron Allen in whatever order you'd prefer. A dynamic backfield, and we know they could finish number 1 and number 2 on the all-time Penn State rushing leaderboard. We'll talk about them a bunch this season. But beyond those guys, there are 5 scholarship running backs representing 3 different recruiting cycles who are trying to state their case as RB3. And not just RB3, but potentially the main guy to grab the baton from Kaytron Allen and Nick Singleton this winter when those guys head off to the NFL. Those names, Cam Wallace, a redshirt sophomore, Quentin Martin and Corey Smith, redshirt freshman, and then true freshmen, Tyke Hayes and Jabri Coleman. Coleman arrived this summer. Hayes was on board for winter conditioning and spring ball. So Stan Drayton has worked with 4 out of the 5. He'll get more familiar with Jabri Coleman in the month ahead. But Mark, out of those 5, who are you most eager to see take the ball, get some opportunities over the course of this month of August?
Yeah, I think Quinn Martin, the versatility, we've heard about it since he was in high school, the ability to catch passes. I think if you're looking at who's going to be a RB3, maybe it's somebody who could bring a little bit different dynamic. Not that the 2 guys who are going to be RB1 and 1A, they're both fully capable of catching passes, but I think he can take it to a little bit different level. And then with all due respect to the other guys, I loved what I've seen of Tyke Hayes. I mean, just like they have him listed at 204, but he plays like he's 235. He just plays with that level of physicality, and he has kind of like that Aliquippa, mentality where he's going to run through people. So a lot to like about that entire group. But if you're asking me the 2 guys or a couple of the guys that I'm really looking out for, it would be those 2. And then obviously, everybody's keeping their fingers crossed that Cam Wallace is going to be fine coming off of the significant injury. So I always say that, knock on wood, hopefully he's going to be fine. But to me, Quinn Martin, I think really has the ability to do so many different things that he could be a weapon for this offense beyond the top 2, or if somebody gets banged up again, knock on wood. And then Tyke with his physicality and how hard he just runs.
Daniel, you've referenced Martin's versatility a bunch. We talked about it last year, how he could be maybe a gadget player for the offense. It didn't work out for him that way as a freshman, but we've seen him running routes, catching some passes in the blue-white game, and you could confuse him pretty easily for a receiver-type talent. Is that where you land in this conversation, or do you look in a different direction beyond Singleton and Allen going into camp?
Yeah, I think Martin gives you the most, flexibility, versatility, someone that you can do some gadgety things with over the course of a game. I think we've seen some juice from Corey Smith. He had that long run in the Washington game. I thought that in the blue-white game, I don't have his stats up, but he showed a willingness, I think, to put his head down, run inside, be physical. He's someone that I think it's easy to be intrigued by a little bit. He had a pretty big weight fluctuation in the spring, but I think going into fall, he's in an interesting position to compete. And then, like Mark said, you hope that Cam Wallace is healthy coming back from that injury. He's another one of these guys that has come in and really transformed his body over the course of his career. He was someone that in that recruiting class was really an athlete coming out of Georgia down there, that he did a ton of different things for that team. And so I think that he's been able to get that coaching from Jaywan Sider, now get that coaching from Stan Drayton in terms of how to refine and learn the different technique points of the game. If he is healthy, I'm curious to see what he looks like and if he can bring maybe a different element than some of these other running backs. How can he differentiate himself? I think overall that's something that I think about with an RB3 is if you're in this group of 5, what do you do that's different than your teammate, and how can you be used in different situations when you need to spell Singleton or Allen or just give someone a different look. And I think right now Martin is the guy that presents the most options and the most versatility there.
Kind of back to your point you made earlier on Anthony Donko, Cam Wallace is the guy who won the job last year, but it was a different position coach in Jaywan Sider. Quentin Martin and Corey Smith were still working through their first few months on campus. And I don't know, if you told me you can watch one of these running backs take 10 snaps against the first team defense and just take a look at what it looks like, I might lean towards Tyke Hayes. Because you remember what Chris Berman used to say? When Mike Allstott would get that's what I hear in my head when I see Tyke Hayes in drills on the field and scrimmage action. And there's something very, very different about this kid. You look at his lower body, that base that's built. You're right. He has the lower body of a 235-pounder, Mark. We'll see the rest of his body fill in, but he is ready, I think, to maybe take on Big Ten defenders starting at the practice level here at Penn State. And if he produces some oohs and ahs and shows he can pass protect, that's a key part for any freshman. I think it could be really tough for Stan Drayton not to get a look at him in September. And let's be honest, if a running back goes out there in the second half of one of these non-conference games, turns 7 touches into something really special, they could earn themselves a longer look at the start of Big Ten play. This is going to be an open competition, I think, beyond August through non-conference action. I think that's the right approach when you're considering what these guys haven't done. And let's remember, Jabril Coleman was committed to Georgia when they were the national champions. His recruiting luster went out a little bit between then and where we are now, but he's the other freshman on campus, and he's got a lot of talent he's bringing to the field too. So a lot to work with that running back beyond those top two. Katron Allen, Nick Singleton, I'll knock on wood for everybody here, but they have been relatively quite healthy for the load that they have carried throughout their careers together going back to 2002. If that continues, there will be limited opportunities beyond non-conference play for running backs to come in and do a bunch of damage, but there will be opportunities. Elsewhere in the backfield, guys, we'll finish at quarterback. And once again, no questions about it. At the top of this step chart, it's Drew Aller, senior, third-year starter. Beyond him, though, we're trying to figure out who's not only going to be the next man up this season, but again, who might take that baton next winter when Drew Aller turns his attention to the NFL, and who might step into spring practice in 2026 as the perceived favorite to be Penn State's next starting quarterback. It's Ethan Grunkemeyer as a redshirt freshman. It's Jackson Smoke as a redshirt sophomore. No disrespect to the true freshman Beckham Kritza, but until any of these Penn State coaches start including him in the conversation about that competition, we're not going to start including him. And so, Mark, with these two players, again, it goes beyond just who's getting the backup reps against Nevada on August 30th. It's about who might have to step up at some point for a national championship contender at quarterback, or a little bit more long-term, who's going to show up in 2026 as the potential face of this offense at quarterback, or at least be a step ahead of the rest in that race.
Yeah, just to rewind, Chuck Losey told us the last time we saw him, which was earlier this month. I'm sorry, I'm getting it screwed up. Jax has rebounded tremendously from that knee. You wouldn't know any difference watching them out there on the field. So it sounds like Smolik is fine after being very limited last year. We saw him in some practice action, but not doing anything significant. But I don't think you can undervalue the benefit that Grunk got from getting QB2 reps in practice throughout the playoffs. I don't think anybody wanted to see Bo Prabula go, but in hindsight, thankfully everybody stayed healthy. Hopefully it works out for Bo. I think that ended up being a blessing in disguise that you're ending up with a quarterback who was able to take those reps. Did we really see it come to fruition? No. I mean, in out on the field in games, no. But I think being able to go through game week process, and not just game week, but playoff game week process multiple times, that had to be invaluable for Grunk. So to me, I think he's the clear leader. James Franklin is not going to say that. But I don't know how he couldn't be, given the experience that he was able to gain. And then all things kind of being equal, and they sure did look equal in spring practice, right? I mean, you had Aller taking reps kind of on his own, and then you had those two taking reps. So, yeah, I don't want to say that Smolik's completely out of it by any stretch of the imagination. We still have camp to go through. But I think heading into camp, Grunk has to have an advantage just based on what he was able to do in preparing for playoff games.
And a couple things there. Smolik was able to get back on the field for practice last fall. He never advanced to the point where he was full go and doing as much as the other quarterbacks, but it's not like he was out of sight, out of mind for the entire year. He got into the practice field this spring ready to roll, and I think a lot of the feedback we got from James Franklin and from other folks in the program was that they were almost surprised that he kind of didn't miss a beat. They were sensing more of there's going to be rust to work through. Maybe by the second half of spring camp, they'd see him turn the corner. Felt like he showed up ready to roll. And so I went from, very, very dark pencil, putting Grunkemeyer, as QB2 to maybe erasing a little bit of that and kind of leaving it open for interpretation, because I think with Smolik, something we saw in the Beaver Stadium appearance for him in the spring game, which is really our longest look at him this point, especially against the live defense, he's got some improvisational skills to his abilities out there at quarterback. He can move, he can direct traffic a little bit, and I think that's a really important aspect to watch of this competition. It's not just going to be following through on the coach's orders and directing traffic on offense. It's going to be how do each of them respond to adversity, a pass rush, the moments in a game that can tip the balance, because you just don't know. So they're going to get a read for that, I would imagine, working these guys up against a bunch of good Penn State defenders. But Daniel, the fact of the matter is they own a combined 2 passes at the college level. Both of those came from Grunkemeyer against SMU in the playoff opener last year. One of them was intercepted. Smolik's been in the game for 2 snaps against Delaware 2 years ago. So we really don't know much about either. But what I do know about college football is when the staff makes its decision, last week of August or whenever they do, whoever is told they're going to be the 3rd quarterback on this depth chart, it's human nature for them to start maybe putting that countdown clock in their head for that December transfer portal to open up. I'm not saying that's going to be their end-all be-all and they're not going to be focused on the team, but this is a big decision for this staff, because the way college football, the way the quarterback position works right now, you're going to be telling one guy that he's next man up. You're going to be telling the other guy that he's not right now, and the clock's ticking in his mind, and there's a lot of other schools out there. I just think that's the nature of the beast of this position more than any other.
Yeah, but at the same time, you point to what happened in December, where suddenly that number 3 quarterback, you're the number 2 quarterback, and you're 1 heartbeat away during the biggest stretch of the season. Mm-hmm. So I think that these guys, I think the way that they're wired and what they've seen and the way that James Franklin kind of grooms that room and coaches them, I think you've got guys that are going to be bought in, and then we'll see how that works out. I did pull up the quotes from Danny O'Brien, the quarterback's coach, from early June, and he said that Smolik came back bigger, faster, and stronger than he's ever been after the injury. He said he had echoed the similar sentiment to you, Tyler, that he was pleasantly surprised by how quickly Smolik was back up to speed. So I do think that it's easy. Like if we were going to put out our projected depth chart, on Friday to preview the season, preview camp, I think Grunkemeyer as the number 2 would make a lot of sense. You might put the or in there faintly, but I do think that Smolik really does have the potential to have that be a real competition this year. And I think that I wouldn't be surprised if we get to Nevada and Smolik is that number 2 quarterback. I think that it's something that is on the table there. We'll see. I mean, we've heard a lot of really good things about Smolik. Even when he was hurt, I think James Franklin went out of his way to praise him and single out how he was staying engaged, these different things. Was that something Franklin was doing to the mind games, those sorts of things, the posturing, or how legit is that? I think that's something that we'll learn. But I'm going into this viewing this as in my personal depth chart, I'm putting the big fat or there at the number 2 quarterback spot, where we are right now.
Let's see what these guys can do in August. It'll be fun to follow. We will get some looks starting on Saturday at Penn State practice. We're excited to bring you our practice notebooks again, coming off the field, photo galleries, video highlights, and everything else you expect from us at Lions247.com. As we referenced earlier, on August 1st, you'll notice there will be a new promotion for VIP access at Lions247.com. Take advantage of that. Hop on board with us, and then check out our second episode coming later this week. We'll look at the defensive depth chart and some of the storylines and players that warrant our attention there. Daniel, Mark, appreciate it. A long episode, this one, but kind of working through stuff before we get back on the field. Good to have you both back in town, and we'll share the field again soon. We'll share a podcast even sooner, though.
Good thing we didn't do both sides of the ball. We did a 2.5-hour podcast.
That's right. Well, good stuff from both of you. I'll talk to you both soon.
Yep.
That's going to do it for this episode of the Lions 24/7 podcast. We'll circle back with those two again for another episode on defense later this week. Saturday, we're back at Penn State facilities. You don't want to miss our coverage at lions247.com throughout the month of August and then into the season. Excited to have you covered each step of the way. For now, stepping aside, thanks as always for listening or watching. I'm Tyler Donahue, and this has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.